The emergency entrance of Voss Heron Medical Center had not been breached in 11 years. It was breached that night. The reinforced glass doors blew inward with a sound like a gunshot, and two men came through first. Dressed in black tactical clothing with no agency markings, faces pale with the pallor of people who had been running not from something, but towards something they were terrified of losing. Behind them, a stretcher came through the entrance so fast it nearly clipped the doorframe, carried by two more, who moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that seconds were not abstract, that seconds were the difference between a king and a corpse. On the stretcher lay Aldrich. The hospital was one of 7 in the country that operated under the Joint Accord, facilities licensed to treat both human and vampire patients, staffed accordingly, bound by the confidentiality protocols that had made the 2003 coexistence agreement function in practice rather than just on paper. The night staff had seen difficult cases. They had seen vampire trauma. They had seen the particular category of wound that ancient biology produced when it was pushed past its extraordinary limits. They had not seen this. Even unconscious, even broken, Aldrich did not look diminished. Broad through the shoulder, pale in the way that his kind were always pale, but now carrying a grayness beneath it that did not belong. His chest rising in shallow intervals that made every medical professional in the room count instinctively. His left side bore the wound. The clothing had been cut away, pressure dressings applied in the field, soaked through twice over in blood that was darker than human blood, and carried, even at this distance, the faint metallic signature that Accord-trained staff learned to recognize in orientation. But it was not the blood that stopped the room, it was what caused it. The wound had a quality that the attending physician would spend 3 minutes searching his training for before arriving at the correct entry in the Joint Accord Medical Codex, subsection 9, the section he had read during certification and genuinely believed he would never need. A single entry point, left side, angled precisely upward. The edges carried a darkness that was not bruising and not burning, a slow, spreading stain moving outward from the wound in gradual fingers, like ink dropped into still water. A cursed blade wound. The Codex listed it as historically documented, last confirmed use 3 centuries ago, the final known blade melted down and destroyed by order of the Vampire High Council. Someone had kept a peace. The attending stepped forward, hands already moving, and that was when the room learned what else had come through those broken doors. The Hellhound came out of the shadow alongside the stretcher and placed itself between the doctor and the king. In a world where vampires and humans shared cities, shared hospitals, shared transit systems and coffee shops and legal frameworks, the existence of hellhounds was one of the details that the coexistence agreement had required the most negotiation to address. They were not common. They were not domestic. They were ancient creatures that existed at the outer boundary of what the Joint Accord supernatural classification system had been designed to contain, and their presence in a civilian medical facility was, technically, a violation of 17 different protocols. This one was enormous, not in the way that large animals are enormous, where size is simply scale. Enormous in the way ancient things are enormous, in presence, in weight, in the sense that the air around it was different, older. Its coat was the color of coal that had never fully cooled, carrying a deep red luminescence along the edges that pulsed like an ember breathing. Its eyes were the color of hot iron. Its shoulders came level with the stretcher frame. And when it turned those eyes on the approaching doctor, the man stopped walking without deciding to stop. The sound that came from the Hellhound's chest was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the sound of something that had never once in its existence made a threat it did not intend to keep. "Get back," a nurse whispered. Nobody needed to be told twice. The stretcher came to rest in Trauma Bay 1, and the Hellhound, the creature called Dreg, bound by blood covenant to Aldrich, moved to stand directly beside it, one massive shoulder pressed against the gurney rail. His head dropped to hover just above Aldrich's chest, close enough that each shallow breath moved the fur around Dreg's muzzle. His eyes never stopped moving. Every doctor, every doorway, every hand that twitched toward the stretcher. "Someone call supernatural containment," the senior nurse said quietly, reaching for the wall panel. One of the tactical men shook his head. "He's blood-bound to the king. You activate a containment protocol on a bonded hellhound, and you risk breaking the covenant. And if the covenant breaks while the king is in this condition, then we lose him faster than the wound would take him." No one had an answer to that. The trauma bay had gone still in the way rooms go still before something terrible or extraordinary happens. Staff stood in a rough semicircle at a distance they had arrived at collectively and without discussion. Close enough to look useful, far enough from Dreg to breathe. The security personnel near the entrance had hands near their containment devices, the specialized equipment that joint accord facilities were required to carry for exactly this category of situation. Two of them were looking at their supervisor with an expression that asked a very specific unspoken question. If the Hellhound moved on a staff member, they would have to use those devices. And if they used containment on a covenant-bound creature while the king was still alive and critical, no one finished the thought out loud. The cursed blade's darkness was still spreading. That was when the woman stepped out from the far side of the bay. She had been there the entire time. That was the thing that would stay with people afterward, not what she did, but that she had simply been standing where the light did not quite reach, and no one had noticed her. She was not hiding. She was simply the kind of person that rooms did not register until they needed to. She was perhaps 40, carrying it the way certain people carry age, in posture and precision rather than appearance, blonde hair pulled back without ceremony, hospital scrubs with no department marking, no seniority badge, nothing to distinguish her from any other staff member on a long overnight shift. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was composed in the way of someone who had decided many years ago that visible fear cost more than it was worth. She walked toward the stretcher, not fast, not slow, the walk of someone who had already calculated the distance and found nothing in it requiring adjustment. Dreg heard her and turned. The sound from his chest deepened, less heard than felt, a vibration in the sternum. His weight shifted forward, one massive paw advancing half a step, the posture of a creature not yet attacking because it had not yet decided to. She did not stop. She came within 3 feet of the Hellhound and lowered herself to one knee, not in submission, in precision. She brought herself to his eye level and stayed very still for exactly one breath. Then she leaned forward and spoke. 7 syllables. Low, measured, unhurried. Not English, not any language spoken in that hospital or in common use anywhere in the modern world. It was old in a way that felt less like antiquity and more like depth, something that had not simply existed a long time, but had been used for purposes that left a residue in the syllables themselves. The language of the blood covenant, the private operational tongue of the Ashvale Company, a vampire special operations unit that had been classified, deployed, and officially destroyed 20 years ago. Known only to those who had taken the oath at the unit's founding, who had spoken those syllables in a basement facility in Eastern Europe before their first deployment, who had carried them into the dark on operations that appeared in no government record, joint accord, or otherwise. Dreg stopped, not gradually, not with reluctance. He simply stopped, the way a held breath releases, the way a wave breaks and draws back. He sat down. His head dropped slowly and came to rest against Aldrich's chest. His eyes closed. The growl was gone. The ember light dimmed to something quieter. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the man beneath his head. The silence in the trauma bay was absolute. Security had gone completely rigid. The attending physician was staring at the woman still on one knee beside the gurney as though she had violated a law he had not known existed. She stayed there for 3 more seconds. Then she rose, turned to face the room, and said 2 words. He'll allow it. The attending blinked. Then, because there was nothing else to do and because the king was dying, he moved. The room snapped back into motion. Monitors, assessment, hands moving with urgent professionalism, voices clipped with the efficiency of people doing what they had been trained to do. The woman, her hospital ID badge read Marin, staff physician, joint accord certified, stepped back to the wall. She stood with her hands clasped loosely in front of her, watching the team work. Not the posture of a staff physician observing a procedure. The posture of someone who had stood exactly like this before, in darker places, watching other hands work on other bodies, and had learned through repetition the precise way to be present without interfering. As she watched, something moved through her that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The 7 syllables had come to her lips without effort, rising from a depth she had spent 20 years filling with other things. And hearing them in her own voice again, in this room, in this fluorescent light, with the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of cardiac monitors, had pulled with them something she had almost succeeded in burying, a name, not Marin. The other name? The one her unit had used, spoken in the shorthand of people who trusted each other across deployments that left no records. She had not allowed herself to think it in 20 years. But the syllables of the covenant had carried it to the surface the way deep water carries wreckage, not asked for, not chosen, simply arriving. She pushed it back down, not the time. Internal hemorrhage, left cavity, she said quietly, before the attending turned back to his instruments. Below the primary wound site. He stopped, looked at her, looked at his monitors, back at her. "Check it," she said. He checked. She was right. The room went quieter after that. They had been working for 20 minutes when the first sign appeared that the night was not finished with them. It came as sound, a deep rhythmic percussion building from the rooftop access above, felt first in the floor, then in the chest. A vibration with nothing to do with storm or mechanical failure. A helicopter, more than one, military-grade rotors making no attempt at quiet. A security guard moved to the internal camera display. His face changed. Black Fleet, no agency markings. No clearance request filed with air traffic. No clearance request. In 11 years of joint accord operation, no one had accessed the Voss Heron rooftop without a filed request processed through the Council's Civilian Liaison Office. The absence did not mean someone had forgotten the paperwork. It meant someone had decided the paperwork did not apply to them tonight. Dreg raised his head from Aldrich's chest and looked toward the trauma bay entrance. The ember light in his fur pulsed once, not the hot pulse of combat readiness, something quieter, recognition. Marin felt it in the floor before she heard it clearly, the percussion of landing, the settling silence that followed. She knew that pattern. She had known it in a different life, in a different darkness, on the outskirts of a city that no longer appeared on any map she was allowed to access. She knew who had come. She knew what it meant when they arrived without asking anyone's permission. Dreg looked at her. In the Hellhound's iron eyes, she saw something she had not expected. Not the blank intensity of a creature in guard mode, but something that looked, with unsettling precision, like the recognition of a specific person. Not a stranger who had spoken a useful phrase. Someone the creature had been, in whatever way ancient things waiting for, which should have been impossible. Dreg was Aldrich's creature. His covenant ran only to the king, unless someone had made it run further. The thought arrived and rearranged the things around it. She filed it away. Outside on the roof of Voss Heron Medical Center, boots met concrete. The night, which had already taken everything it could from the last 20 years, was not finished yet. The men who came through the stairwell door did not announce themselves. There were 4 of them, moving with the economy of people who had spent so long operating in environments where unnecessary motion got people killed that stillness had become their natural state. Civilian clothing, no visible weapons, no joint accord agency credentials displayed, Nothing to identify rank or affiliation. Just 4 men, and the way they occupied space, and the fact that every person in the trauma bay corridor stepped back when they entered without being asked. The attending physician straightened. "This is a restricted medical area. You'll need to show—" The man at the front of the group looked at him once. The physician stopped talking. The man was 60, perhaps a few years past it, broad through the chest in the way that men who have carried weight for decades remain broad long after the specific weight is gone. Hair entirely silver, cut without vanity. His face carried the geography of someone who had made consequential decisions in difficult places for a very long time. Not harsh, but resolved. The face of a man who had already had every argument worth having and had stopped being surprised by how they ended. His name was Adrian, former commander of the Ashvale Company, which had operated for 6 years under a joint council black budget authorization that had since been redacted from every record that acknowledged its existence. The man who had, in the months following the unit's official destruction, driven alone to a facility in the Scottish Highlands and spent 2 days cutting 12 names into black granite in a courtyard that received no official visitors. He walked into the trauma bay and stopped. His eyes found Dreg first. The Hellhound was motionless at Aldrich's side, watching the arrivals with the cataloging attention of an ancient creature that assessed before it acted. Edrin looked at the Hellhound for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not grief, not surprise. Something older than both. Then his eyes moved across the room, and when they found Marin standing at the far wall in unmarked hospital scrubs, the man who had walked through 2 decades of classified operations and officially sanctioned silence went completely still. His right hand was shaking, not much, not visibly to anyone not looking for it, but Marin was always looking. She saw the tremor in the hand of a man who had earned the right to steadiness a dozen times over, and she understood what it cost him to show it. He crossed the room and stopped 2 feet in front of her. Then he raised his right hand, brought it flat against his chest, palm inward. A gesture so old and specific it had not been used in any official context since the Ashvale Company was decommissioned and declared destroyed in the same classified memorandum, the Blood Covenant Salute, reserved for the living. The corridor went very quiet. Marin held his gaze. Then she raised her own right hand, brought it to her chest, and returned the gesture without hesitation. Adrian's breath came out unsteady. "I did not know you were alive." "Neither did most of the world," Marin said. "I looked." No performance in it. Plain statement. Plain weight. After the official reports were finalized, after the memorial was built. 3 years before they reassigned me somewhere, I couldn't look anymore. He paused. I left a space empty. On the granite, 13th space. I didn't want to be wrong about it. Something shifted between them. Not softened, clarified. They took a consultation room at the end of the corridor, the kind of small, overlit room that hospitals keep for difficult conversations, with chairs that were designed for comfort and achieved it poorly. One of Edrin's men stood at the door. Through the wall came the muffled sounds of the trauma bay continuing its work. Edrin sat across from Marin at a narrow table and folded his hands and began. He had known within a week. Not the name, not then, but the shape of it. The Ashvale Company's operational route that night had been changed at the last hour, deviated from the filed plan on authorization from a council coordination officer whose name Edrin had submitted for joint council investigation twice in the following months and twice received back unprocessed, marked with a category code he had never encountered before or since. Jurisdiction withheld. High Council authority. Someone above the investigation had closed the door before it opened. He had been reassigned 6 months later to a senior advisory position in Oslo, a title that functioned as exile, placing him far enough from the council's operational center that the threads he had been pulling could not be reached without raising flags that would have ended more than his career. I went back to the memorial every year, he said, on the anniversary, alone. 12 names I put there myself. His jaw tightened. And 1 space I left because I could not make myself fill it. Marin was quiet. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her scrubs and removed something small, a fragment of material, old and dark with age, folded into a tight square. She placed it on the table between them. "I took this from Soren," she said. "The last one I reached before I couldn't reach anyone else. He pressed it into my hand. I don't know where he got it or how long he'd been carrying it." She looked at the folded cloth. "There's a name on it." Edrin looked at it, but did not touch it. "Have you confirmed it?" "Within 2 years of disappearing. I've had the name for 18 years. The silence had weight. "Why didn't you?" "Because a dead woman with a piece of cloth has no standing before the Joint Council or any human court," Marin said. "Because the same authority that closed your investigation twice would have closed me permanently the moment I surfaced. I had one piece of evidence. No institutional support, no protection. The only thing keeping me alive was the fact that they believed I wasn't." She paused. "So I stayed dead." Edrin nodded slowly. Not absolution, neither offered nor sought. The recognition of a logic that had been sound even when it was painful. "Aldrich," he said, "what did you know about the sealed file?" "I didn't know whether it meant he was protecting the investigation or participating in burying it." "He was protecting it," Edrin exhaled. "In the 5 years since he assumed formal leadership of the Council, Aldrich has been quietly reconstructing the case. He located 4 former coordination officers from that period. 2 had already disappeared. 1 gave testimony, 1 went to the Council's oversight board the following morning and was found dead by nightfall in his car outside a parking structure in Geneva. He looked at the folded cloth. Aldrich was 8 weeks from a formal review demand that could not be procedurally blocked. Someone on the Council knew it. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered did so with the confidence of someone who had never in his professional life been required to ask. Not physically imposing, medium build, dark civilian coat, no visible credentials. His face was pleasant in the way that certain dangerous things were pleasant, smooth, arranged, carrying an expression of mild interest, selected for utility rather than honesty. He looked around the room with the unhurried attention of a man assessing the value of everything he saw. "Lord Edrin," he said, with the courtesy of someone who uses titles to establish distances rather than honor them. Then his eyes moved to Marin and the physician. Marin said nothing. He produced a credential wallet, halfway open, enough to show a seal, not enough to be read clearly. Adjudicator Krail, Joint Council Oversight Division. He placed himself at the end of the table without invitation. "I apologize for the hour." "Why are you here?" Edrin said, not a question. "Because a Hellhound entered full combat mode in a Joint Accord civilian medical facility and was stopped by a staff physician using a Blood Covenant command phrase from a unit officially dissolved 20 years ago." Krail's expression remained pleasant. "That category of anomaly generates documentation that reaches my office." He looked at Marin with the mild interest of a man who found problems professionally useful. "You understand the difficulty." "Tell me," Marin said. "The difficulty is that you exist. A living member of the Ashvale Company contradicts 6 sealed Joint Council resolutions, 2 official dissolution declarations, and a memorial ceremony attended by 9 currently serving Council members." He paused. "Your existence alone is an institutional problem of considerable scale. Your existence with a covenant phrase on your lips, in a room full of witnesses, on a night already generating significant incident documentation," he gestured, as though completing the sentence required more words than the idea deserved, "that is something else entirely." "She saved the king's life," Edrin said. "Yes," Krail agreed, with the pleasantness entirely intact. "That complicates the problem rather than resolving it." Marin studied him. She had spent 20 years developing the skill of reading people who did not want to be read. The difference between what someone said and what they needed, between what they showed and what they were protecting. Krail was skilled, better than most. But there was something in the way he had entered, in the precise management of how much credential he had allowed to be visible. "You already knew I was alive," she said. Creel's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Something small and deep, like a light shifting behind glass. "How long?" she said. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be a confession. 3 years, he said at last. A biometric anomaly flagged through a Joint Accord Health Registry cross-reference, matched against dormant Ashvale Company physiological markers held in the classified archive. Probabilistic match, not confirmed. I chose not to escalate. You chose not to escalate, Edrin repeated very quietly, in the tone of a man managing something enormous. I maintained optionality, Creel said. Living Ashvale survivor, unconfirmed, in a stable civilian medical position. That is a dormant asset. Dormant assets are useful precisely because they can be activated or contained as circumstances require. He looked at Marin without apology. You were not in danger while you remained invisible. And now, Marin said, now you have stepped out of the shadow at exactly the wrong moment. Something that was not pleasantness moved across his face. Cold, pragmatic. I came to assess the situation, to determine the appropriate institutional response. The appropriate response, Marin said, would have been to not destroy the unit in the first place. The room went very still. Creel looked at her for a long moment. I did not give that order, he said carefully. But you know who did. He did not answer, which was, in its way, the clearest answer he had given since walking through the door. His eyes moved to the folded cloth on the table between them. They stayed on it precisely 1 second longer than a man with nothing to hide would have allowed. Marin saw it. She picked the cloth up and returned it to her inside pocket without a word. Creel watched it disappear, and his jaw tightened by a fraction he could not fully prevent. He knew what name was on that cloth. And now he knew that she knew that he knew. From the corridor outside came a nurse's voice, sharp and urgent. The consultation room door opened a crack. Dr. Marin, the patient's vitals are shifting. He's coming out of sedation. Marin was already standing. She moved through the door before either man could speak, back into the corridor, back toward the trauma bay and the gurney and the Hellhound who had held his position through all of it with the patience of a creature that understood, in whatever wordless way such things understood, that the night still had further to go. Behind her, Creel rose from his chair with the unhurried precision of a man recalculating a position he had believed was secure. The cloth, he said to Edrin quietly. If she uses it before I can manage the framing, then perhaps, Edrin said, 20 years of silence compressed into 8 words, it is past time for it to be read. Down the corridor, Dreg let out a single low sound, not a growl, not an alarm, something between the two, the sound of a creature that had held a perimeter for a very long time and could feel, in the way that blood-bound things feel, that the man it was guarding was about to return to the world. The trauma bay had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something inevitable is close, not silent. The monitors continued their steady work. The nursing staff moved, adjusted, watched the vital displays with the focused attention of professionals who had chosen a discipline built entirely on refusing to accept the irreversible. But beneath all of it, beneath the clinical sounds of a room doing what it was built to do, there was a stillness that had not been there an hour ago. Dreg felt it first. He had remained motionless at Aldrich's side through the assessment, through the intervention, through the long, careful work of pulling a king back from the edge of something permanent. His breathing had been slow and matched, the ember light in his coat barely above its resting state. He had looked for the better part of 2 hours like a creature that had finally allowed itself to rest. He was not resting. Marin had come back into the trauma bay 2 minutes ahead of Edrin and Creel and taken her position near the wall. She watched Dreg the way she had learned to watch everything, with the patient peripheral attention of someone who understood that the most important information rarely arrived directly. Dreg's weight had shifted forward imperceptibly. His breathing had separated from the slow, matched rhythm of the king's sedated pattern into something faster, more alert. He was tracking a change the monitors had not yet registered. "He's coming up," Marin said. The attending looked at her, then at his monitors, then at her again. "Prepare for controlled surfacing." "No." Marin moved from the wall, positioning herself at Aldrich's right side. A controlled reduction at this stage creates a disorientation interval. He surfaces into pain without context, and in that state he reaches for the deepest instinct he has. That instinct is not a peaceful one. She looked at the attending steadily. Let him come up naturally. Give him something to orient to before he orients to the wound. The attending held her gaze, then stepped back in the way that people step back when they have decided, without articulating the decision, that someone else in the room holds more relevant authority over a specific situation than their credential would suggest. Dreg made a sound, low, brief, somewhere between a rumble and an exhale. His tail moved once. Marin turned to the gurney and leaned forward slightly, bringing herself into Aldrich's eye line. His face was still, but the stillness was changing texture, the deep flatness of sedation giving way to something more troubled, more present. She spoke quietly. Not his name, just words, low and even, the kind that gave a surfacing mind something to hold before it understood what it was holding. "You're in the hospital. You're not in the field. The wound has been treated. You're not alone." A pause. Dreg pressed his head gently against the king's arm. "Your Hellhound is here. He hasn't left your side." Aldrich's hands moved first. A slow tension in the fingers, involuntary, the body preparing for something the mind had not finished deciding. His chest expanded with a breath that had intention behind it. His eyes opened. Gray, his eyes, the deep, unsettled gray of a winter sky before weather. They moved across the ceiling tiles first, the instinctive upward sweep of a man who had woken in hostile environments often enough to have built a protocol for it. Then down, the room, the monitors. Dreg, who pressed harder against his arm at the moment of eye contact and made a sound entirely unlike anything he had produced all night. Low, broken, almost tender. The sound of a creature that had held itself together through sustained will and was finally allowed to loosen. Aldrich's hand moved to Dreg's head. The Hellhound closed his eyes. Then Aldrich's gaze moved across the trauma bay and stopped. He looked at Marin the way a man looks at something his conscious mind has not yet caught up to, but his deeper recognition has been holding the coordinates for across a very long distance. His lips moved. "Voss," he said. Not Marin. The other name. The name that existed in no current document, no living personnel file, no surface that the present world could access. The name her unit had used, spoken in the operational shorthand of people who trusted each other with their lives across deployments that produced no public record. The name she had pushed back down when the 7 syllables brought it to the surface. Now it was in the fluorescent air of a modern hospital trauma bay, spoken by a voice she had never expected to speak it, and it landed with the precise force of something that had been traveling toward her for 20 years. The room registered the weight of it without understanding its content. Edrin, standing at the trauma bay entrance, went completely still. Crail, half a step behind, said nothing. But his eyes sharpened in a way that was not difficult to read. Marin held Aldrich's gaze. "Steady. You're in Voss Heron Medical. You were injured at a training facility. The wound has been treated. Do you understand where you are?" His brow tightened. Pain or concentration, or the effort of holding 2 timelines in the same mind at once. "I know where I am. I know what the wound is. I know what it means that someone had a cursed blade in a controlled training environment." His eyes did not leave her face. "And I know what it means that you're here and that Dreg let you reach him. Rest." "I've been resting for 3 hours." The flatness of a man who did not intend to be managed. "I'll rest when this conversation is finished." He found Adrian at the entrance, and something passed between them that needed no language. Then his eyes came back to Marin. "Sit down," he said. And then, from somewhere that commands did not come from, "Please." She pulled a chair from beside the monitoring equipment and sat. Dreg repositioned himself, angling his enormous body to include her in his perimeter, the behavioral equivalent of extending a protected boundary to a second person. "You were told the file was sealed to bury the investigation," Aldrich said. "Everyone was told that. It was the simplest explanation, and it served the people who needed it believed." He paused against the pull of the wound. "It was not the reason." Marin waited. "I was 19, he said. Young even by our standards. No formal standing before the High Council. I received intelligence, from a source I will not name even now, because that source is gone and their family is not, indicating that a council member had sold the Ashvale Company's operational coordinates to a hostile faction in exchange for territorial agreements in Eastern Europe. The intelligence arrived 3 days after the ambush. His jaw tightened. 3 days too late. The trauma bay held its breath. I had a name and no power to act on it. The council member held 3 of the 7 oversight seats. Any formal accusation from a 19-year-old prince would have been referred to that same committee within 24 hours. Evidence destroyed. And then I would have had an accident of my own. He looked at Marin steadily. Sealing the Ashvale file was the only move I had. Sealed files under Joint Council protocol cannot be altered without a full quorum review. It was the only lock I had access to. "You locked the evidence inside the file that was supposed to be their victory," Edrin said quietly from the doorway. "And I waited. 20 years, for enough standing to open it correctly, to open it in a way that could not be closed again." He exhaled. "I was close. 4 of 7 oversight seats aligned. Testimony from a surviving coordination officer. 8 weeks from a formal review demand that could not be procedurally blocked." He looked at the treated wound on his left side, at the clean dressings over what an ancient weapon had done. "And then someone put a cursed blade in my training session." "Dreg," Marin said. The thought she had filed away in the trauma bay, the one that had rearranged the things around it. He responded to the Ashvale Covenant phrase, "He's blood-bound to you." "That shouldn't be possible unless I made it possible." Something that was not quite a smile moved across Aldrich's face, the expression of a man whose 20-year patience had included this. 8 years ago, when I became certain you were alive, I found the original Ashvale Covenant binding documentation, the actual founding records, and I added a secondary conditioning layer to Dreg's Covenant structure, a recognition protocol keyed to the Ashvale command sequence. He paused. "I didn't know when you would surface. I didn't know the circumstances or the location or whether it would be in my lifetime. But I wanted to ensure that if you ever found yourself in a room with him, he would know you for what you are. Not a stranger. Someone with the right to stand at this side." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 20 years understood differently. "You built him a door," Marin said, "for someone you had never spoken to. For someone I had watched crawl out of burning wreckage and choose to survive when every force around her was arguing the other direction." His eyes were steady. "That kind of person deserves a door." Crail stepped forward from the entrance. His pleasantness had been absent since the consultation room. What remained was the careful attention of a man who had arrived with one operational map and found the terrain was entirely different. "This is a significant conversation," he said, "but it doesn't resolve the institutional reality of adjudicator." Aldrich turned his head with deliberate precision, the movement careful against the wound but committed. "You've been in this facility for nearly an hour. You haven't once asked about my condition, my prognosis, or the nature of the weapon used against me. You've spent that hour attempting to determine whether the physician who saved my life represents a manageable problem." His eyes had gone from troubled gray to something colder. "I am the head of the High Council. She is under my protection, and the conversation you just interrupted is above your jurisdictional authority." Crail was quiet. He reached into his jacket, produced his phone. The encrypted council communication device, the kind that received transmissions from a very short list of authorized senders. He read it. His face underwent the structural adjustment of a man discovering that the load-bearing elements of his position have been quietly removed. "There is a directive," he said carefully, "from the Council's senior oversight chair, issued 42 minutes ago, authorizing a full review of the Ashvale Company file and all associated sealed documentation. Open session, full council quorum required." He looked at Aldrich. "Effective upon your formal request." The 8 weeks had become tonight. "Then I formally request it," Aldrich said. Crail nodded once. He straightened his jacket, the gesture of a man restoring a surface when the interior had shifted in ways he had not finished processing. He moved toward the corridor. Then Aldrich said, "Crail." The adjudicator stopped. "The name on that cloth." Aldrich's voice was quiet, entirely even. The voice of a man who had been patient for 20 years and had reached the end of patience's useful life. "You looked at it when she set it on the table. You recognized the material, which means you know what name is written on it." A pause. "Which means you have always known, not for 3 years, not since your registry cross-reference, before that." Another pause, shorter. "How long before that?" The trauma bay had never been so quiet. Crail did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in the stillness of him, in the way a man stands when the terrain he has navigated his entire career has simply run out beneath his feet. Dreg rose from Aldrich's side. He did not growl. He did not advance. He simply stood to his full height, his ember light pulsing steady and slow, and looked at Crail with the absolute attention of a creature that had been reading rooms full of dangerous people since before any modern institution existed. Crail looked at the Hellhound, then at Aldrich. "The review will be thorough," he said at last. The pleasantness was gone entirely. What remained was something stripped down, not honest exactly, but no longer performing. "There are things in that file that will be very difficult for certain people to survive. Professionally. Otherwise." He glanced once at Marin, not with hostility, with something that might have been, in a different man with a different history, the beginning of something like recognition. "She should understand that testifying will carry a cost. She has been paying costs for 20 years, Edrin said from the doorway, that were not hers to pay. Crayley held the room for one more moment. Then he left. The space he vacated felt cleaner. Edrin crossed to the foot of the gurney and stood there, looking at Aldrich with the expression of a man completing an errand that had taken the better part of his adult life. "I need to reach 3 aligned oversight members before dawn, before anyone on the other side of this has time to coordinate a response." "Go," Aldrich said. "Use the facility's secure line. Take my team." Edrin nodded. He turned toward the corridor, then turned back, the way people turn back when they have been carrying something so long that setting it down requires a ceremony they did not know they would need. He looked at Marin. She reached into the inside pocket of her scrubs and took out the folded cloth. She held it for a moment, 18 years of weight in something no larger than a man's palm, and then she held it out to him. Edrin looked at it. He understood what she was doing, not surrendering it. Choosing the moment for it to become what it had always been meant to be, not a burden carried alone in the dark, but evidence placed in the right hands at the right time, moving toward the purpose it had been waiting for since a dying man pressed it into her palm on a field that was on fire. He took it, his fingers closed around it carefully, the way you hold something that has cost more than it appears to have cost. "The memorial," he said. His voice was rough. "When this is finished, the empty space on the granite." Marin met his eyes. "Leave it," she said quietly, "for the ones who should have it. They earned that wall. I just survived." Adrian stood for a moment reading her face, understanding the distinction she was drawing and respecting it the way men who have seen enough understand how to respect a choice that costs something real. He nodded once. Then he left. The trauma bay emptied gradually, the medical staff reduced to the maintenance of a stable patient. 2 security personnel at the entrance, doing their jobs with the quiet focus of people who had decided the best contribution they could make to the remainder of this night was to be unobtrusive. Aldrich looked at Marin across the settled space between them. "You could come back," he said. "Not operationally, advisory capacity, protected under council authority. There are positions that would benefit significantly from someone who knows what you know and has survived what you've survived." "No," she said, simply, without apology. "You're certain." "I was certain the night I chose this life. I'm more certain now." She looked at him with the directness of someone who had spent 20 years being honest with herself about difficult things. "I spent the first part of my life ending things. I've spent the second part keeping them alive. I know which I'm better at. I know which I can live with." She paused. "Some people are meant to come back from the dark. Some are meant to make something out of having been there." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. Dreg settled back against his side, the Hellhound's weight a slow and warm anchor, the ember light in his coat dimming toward something barely above ordinary. Outside the high Trauma Bay windows, the sky had changed without anyone marking the moment. The absolute black of deep city night giving way to the first gray suggestion of something that was not yet dawn, but was no longer dark. Somewhere below, the ordinary sounds of a city continuing its business regardless. "The testimony," Aldrich said. "When the review convenes, I'll need your formal account, your name, your version of events, your confirmation of what you found on that cloth and when. It doesn't require you to return to any operational role or any rank. It only requires you to tell the truth in a room that is finally prepared to hear it." Marin looked at her hands. The cloth was gone, in Idrin's keeping now, moving toward the purpose it had been built for since a dying man pressed it into her palm. She had carried it so long she could still feel the weight of it, a phantom pressure in the inside pocket of her scrubs. The truth in a room prepared to hear it. She had been waiting for that room for 18 years. "Yes," she said. Dreg raised his head and looked at her, those ancient iron eyes, carrying whatever it is that creatures who have outlived most of the world carry in their gaze. The ember light pulsed once, gently. His tail moved, a single slow stroke against the linoleum floor. The same motion he had made when she first knelt beside him in the chaos of the Trauma Bay, before the room knew what she was, before the past had fully arrived. She reached out and placed her hand on his head. He pressed into it without hesitation. A young resident appeared at the Trauma Bay entrance, new to the night rotation, carrying the uncertain energy of someone who had heard things secondhand and was attempting to construct a coherent picture from the fragments. She looked at the room, at Aldrich, stable on the gurney, at the Hellhound at rest, at Marin, sitting on a chair beside the bed, her hand on the ancient creature's head. "Excuse me," the resident said. "Is there anything needed? I wasn't briefed on, who are you exactly?" From somewhere down the corridor, growing fainter as he moved toward the secure communications room and the work that needed doing before sunrise, Edrin's voice carried back. "She is the person," he said, "who should have had her name on a great many walls." A pause. The length of a breath taken and released. But she chose not to need them. The resident looked at Marin with wide eyes, waiting for clarification, for a title, for the category into which a person like this could be organized and understood by someone who had not been in the room for any of it. Marin looked at the doorway where Edrin's voice had been.